We are back again with the Pat Stedman podcast, and this is episode 3 with Will Bartlett, the genius copywriter and recent American transplant from Canada. Very relevant topic today because we're going to be talking about the budding resurgence of American manifest destiny, and we're going to be tying that into Anglo culture, Anglo dating culture in particular, how it's different within the Anglosphere, but also how it like collectively is different from other dating cultures out there in the West. But I think that the real interesting topic here first is like this stuff is it's almost like, is it happening? Is it actually happening? I don't know. I feel like the seeds of a manifestation here with Canada coming into the United States. And I know I want you to put some like brakes on me, pump the brakes on me if that's relevant. But I just tell you, like, it's very weird for me to see this kind of stuff happening because when I was in college, just like totally geeking out, I forget what the website was called. It probably doesn't exist anymore. But I fell onto some website that was really talking about how like America and like in Canada should be together. And I became like obsessed with it. I've been like obsessed with it for like 15 years. Because I've always felt like it made perfect sense. The Declaration of Independence, I don't think a lot of Americans know this, but the Declaration of Independence was specifically for the 13 American colonies and Canada. So Canada was the only country, or the only thing, it was invited to be part of America from the very, very beginning. And America actually invaded Canada during the American Revolution in an attempt to bring them into the Revolution, which failed in part because of the weather and in part because of, I think, a surprising dynamic with the French loyalists, because I think that there was an expectation that the French, because for the little history moment here for people, Quebec had been part of the French Empire up until the French and Indian War. So that was only about 15 years. That only concluded about 15 years prior to the maybe 15 to 20 years prior to the end of the to the beginning of the American Revolution. So they were still French. They weren't that far removed. They had fought against the British. So there was a sense that maybe Canada would join the revolution. But the point is that this has been an ongoing thing since the beginning of the country. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is just like geographically speaking, and I've been to a lot of places in Canada. I've been actually like to almost every corner of Canada except for Ontario, strangely enough. It's like the only but what you find is that there's a lot more similarity regionally between, and this is my perspective, I'm curious what you think, Will, but like if you're British Columbia area, you've got a lot more culturally in common with people from Washington State and Oregon than you do with people from the Maritimes, right? Like and the people from the Maritimes have a lot in common with New England. Alberta has a lot in common with, what we would call the Mountain West in America.
Yeah. So
geography
is culture in a lot of ways.
Yeah, geography is culture. And I think if you have, though, really different people, then it has its own flavoring of it, right? And there still might be some difference, you know what I mean? Like, for instance, there's an Alpine culture in Europe, but there's differences between the Austrian areas and the Italian areas and the French areas and there's still, because they're different people with different languages and backgrounds. But I don't see that as much when it comes to Canada. And it does feel to me like, and this is another thing I'm going to throw in here because I don't think people know this. I don't think I ever really talked about it. Maybe I talked about it like once, but I did my senior thesis at Penn on Canadian Arctic defense policy. So
Very specific.
it's like 100 pages long of like a deep dive into, the Arctic race. This kind of stuff is like eerie to me now because this is like all happening. And when I did it, it was like such an obscure topic. And the real conclusion of the thesis after doing all the research was that like Canada's completely neglected its Arctic, and it's like it's kind of unacceptable from a strategic position where things are going. And if Canada wants to like the only differentiating identity that Canada really had was that it was this Arctic nation. They were using it as this mechanism because a lot of Canadian nationalism in my observation has been like we're just not American. Like so
Yeah,
it's
at least I'm not American. At least I'm
yeah,
not this.
it,
Like
it
it's in the same way. It's like, oh, at least I'm not like my older brother. And it's like that's
yes,
not an identity. And I've talked to you about this before.
it's an anti-identity. It's not an identity. And they were trying to make some sort of anchoring point to give it an identity by trying to frame it as, well, we're an Arctic nation. That's what makes us different
Yeah.
than America. But I was like, yeah, but you don't have like any ice, like your Arctic thing is falling apart. So, anyways, I think it's interesting where we're going here because and maybe you can shed some sort of light on the economic situation and the feasibility of all this stuff, but because we are going to get to the girls, we're going to talk about that. Don't worry, we're talking about the girls too. But
yeah, guys are here for the girls, and they're just like Arctic
well,
policy.
they're gonna have to deal with my senior thesis. They're gonna have to. If you can't handle me at my political theory, then you're not going to get me on my dating stuff. Um, but it seems to me that this issue of like Canadian identity has been even more damaged under the Trudeau regime, partially because you have this like massive immigrant wave. I mean, I'm hearing like 6 to 7 million immigrants coming in, which I think is like 15% or maybe more of Canada's entire population, which is just like it's just a crazy numbers. It almost makes like the numbers coming across the US border seem small to some extent from a per capita
Percentage
standpoint.
wise, yeah.
Yeah, from a percentage standpoint. And I know that there's been a lot of issues with like a lot of Chinese investment in Canada, and I think concerns about that from the American standpoint. But the economy, like I don't we have the real estate, this big real estate bubble in Canada, which I admit I don't fully understand all the implications of, but it's I've seen like the earning value of Canadians is really like low compared to Americans now. It's dipped down, and I really do wonder, like, do you think, without being too prognosticating about, you know, economic events in the future and what kind of stuff that is that going to cause for Canadians, do you think that if it starts to get to a point where the economic benefits of joining the United States are so strong for Canadians because we're hitting Canada with these like massive tariffs on their goods, and so and that the only way for like that if they were to join the US, like the average Canadian is going to receive like a, let's say, 30% bump in earning value. Do you think that this is a possibility?
Well, the way you put it there, I don't think so. Because you just have people would feel bullied into it.
Mm,
And I think that there's a carrot, not stick method. And there's also whether like the whole Trump negotiation thing. Like he negotiates and he leads towards something that's more middle ground. And I could see it be more like like sort of what am I trying to say? Like a protection racket in a way. It's like you're part of us, you're under here in this way, but you're still Canadian. Because most people don't realize, even in Canada, it's like the Queen can veto certain things, or the King now can still veto certain things and has some involvement in the government that they never exercise. But the UK is still involved. So it's like, well, why wouldn't, as you're saying, if we were invited to this other empire that's closer, that is in many ways more culturally similar, why wouldn't we do that? And that to me is sort of guided by what I said, where a lot of Canadians, like I noticed there's a lot when I was traveling, like Canadians would be chatting. And it's like, no, I'm not American. Like, it's such like an embarrassing thing to say. Like it's a weird way to sort of lead and need to not be like that. And what do you even mean? Like you're actually like I always say like the whole Canadians are nice thing is sort of bullshit at this point. I'm like Canadians are nice in the nice guy sort of way, but like they're not kind in the same way that as I've said, you said I moved to the States. People are very kind here. And I think that Canadians need to find an identity first before they can figure out what they want to do with their country. And that's been the thing that's been so splintered over the last 10 to 40 years.
Okay. So you think even with the lack of an identity, you think that that's because that they're still more likely to have to try to figure that out first before just saying, you know what, we don't even know what this is anymore. Let's just come into
Well,
it.
to also make it a better deal for America, like, do you want to adopt a country that it's like getting a crappy foster kid, or do you want
Yeah.
the foster kid to like clean up their act a bit first and then take them in? It's like, okay, we're going to push on you. We're also going to set a positive example. Like you talked about remigration. Like, at what
Mhm.
point does Canada, the UK, Germany even start to be like, maybe we'll copy what the US is going to try and do? And then as things start to get better, it starts to be like, oh, we can be a part of this. But I just don't know why you would want Canada if it doesn't sort some of its things out. Otherwise, it's just 20 new problems and you could just bully them with tariffs anyways.
No, you're right about that. I mean, I think that besides for, the bureaucratic and the image standpoints and, like the idea of having, like a really true continental economy, it would be a beautiful map, as I think Trump would say. The map would look very beautiful, especially if you throw Greenland in there, which I think is almost a foregone conclusion at this point. It seems like it's rapidly moving towards that. But I like what you're saying, and I think it's a very much more natural and likely scenario. I do think there's probably going to be a lot of economic pressure, but it is true also that, and even just thinking from the standpoint of like identity, right? Um, you almost like if you make it too adversarial, you almost create an identity more. You almost create like a resistance point. Whereas versus making it like a pull, like we're doing something really amazing in America, and we're also obliterating the woke mind control globally. So the chains on Canada, and I think the rest of the Western world, I think we're going to start to gradually see this stuff fall. And we're talking about it, this like the annexation of Canada, but I've heard people in the UK, and I'm not even sure if Trump made the comment himself. I know a psychic made the comment a few years ago, and I was like, what the fuck? They talked about Canada and the UK eventually joining the United States. And I was like, that's wild. But now as I'm starting to see some of this stuff, I'm like, is this even, maybe this is possible. I don't know if it's going to be possible. I don't know if it's going to happen under the exact same system that we have right now. Because I'm not, I just think that there's like, and I say this in a positive sense, there's so many changes, there's so many structural changes going on. I don't even know if the same iteration of the United States is going to exist by the end of the decade. And so it may be that there's some other structure. I know that conspiracy theorists will talk about like North American Union, and this is exactly what like, deep state, but I think this is a different flavor from that
Yeah.
at any rate. Because they're certainly not in control anymore. This is a much more, and I don't think we're going south. I know some people have talked about Mexico, but I don't see that happening. I think even just the premise of the wall being built and the obsession with having the wall built indicates that there's not like a real interest in trying to have that happen. But I don't know if you're frozen there, Will, or if you're just really doing a good job at. I think Will's frozen, but maybe we'll bring Will back on. We'll bring Will back on in a moment when he gets himself back. But this is just some stuff that I was really thinking about with the yeah, I was looking at you. I'm like I was like,
Guy
is
can
he
stay really still.
is he like a mime right now? I'm like, how did he do this? Like, um, But I think to the point that you were making, there's going to be more of a positive pull where you see like the governments resisting this kind of stuff, in the mind control apparatus resisting this kind of stuff. But I think as you gradually see the populations of these countries coming more into, this is a sense of who are we? Are we free people? We want to emulate what they're doing in the United States. We want to be a part of what the United States is creating. And so there's a positive motivation to want to join. And there may be the stick too, which is that if we don't, we're going to be economically worse off. But there has to be like a positive motivation too. I think you're right. A desire for it to happen. And one thing that was interesting to me, was back at like the trucker protests. I actually started to see like the seeds of this happening, because there was all this like resistance to the vaccine going on in the US, and Canada was really super strict on that. And you had the trucker protest, which was a protest against the government's vaccine mandates. And I swear, like, just because of the timing of it, that because things were starting to spiral over in Canada, and it was starting to spread. There was truckers in America that were getting ready to join the protest and link up. And I think that, you were starting to see the beginnings of a continental freedom movement. And the only thing that really stopped that was the Russo-Ukraine war, and I wonder if because it changed the news cycle, it changed the narrative, it made like and I wonder about that, because the reason Russia decided to invade, at least at that moment, was because Ukraine began intensifying fire along the contact line of the Donbass. And so it's like Ukraine provoked at that moment Russia's response, because they were preparing to do an offensive on the Donbass. I know some people were not going to buy that, but whatever. It's an objective fact that the fire on the contact line had like 10x'd during that time period. And I'm wondering if that was like being done in a way to try to, I don't know. But the bottom line is I see the seeds there, but I think you're right. This is going to have to be something that there's going to have to be positive elements of it too, to bring them into the country. And I also,
and one example, like with the tariffs thing, the outcome I see that's actually positive for Canada is like, so right now, essentially, I think it's dairy would be one of the main ones where Trump's like, yeah, this is ridiculous. Like, why are we letting Canada basically have lower prices on their dairy than us? Like, that hurts our dairy farmers. And so he's like, we're gonna put tariffs on it. And Canadians be like, oh, like we can't survive with these tariffs. It's like, well, how is that? And it's like, because there's massive taxes in Canada. And so, like, to me, the healthy outcome would be looking not just at the US and be like, okay, well, what can we do to avoid these tariffs? It would be like, well, why do we have such high taxes that we can't compete with the States?
yeah.
Like that is to me like the healthy outcome. In the same way, it's like, well, these tariffs that Trump's saying is like, they're just stop the flow of drugs and people through the border. And it's like, well, you can say, oh, I'm going to stand up to the bully. Or you could be like, well, actually, like that is actually bad for Canadians too.
Yeah. And I also wonder about I wonder about like what the Crown, and I know I think Will's frozen again, but I wonder about like the Crown response to this kind of stuff. Like if we're gonna see if there does start to be like a popular movement of the people to join the United States as more information comes out, and I think this is just the very beginning of the process. Like this is stuff that's going to be taking more time, a few more years from now, I think, before we see any clear resolution of it. But yeah, Will's just telling me that maybe I'm gonna remove him and pull him back in. Oh, okay. Is this
Man, again,
there's like I still have the other version of you backstage. So I could like put two Wills up here. I could have the first. Should I try it and see what happens here? It's like
be a great
glitch out.
conversation between me and me.
This is bizarre. At any rate, I was just talking about how I think this is going to take some years to play out. And, a lot of people on the right in America say, well, we don't want Canada because they're so liberal. And let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's a good dovetail. We can start to move into some of the dating conversation too here. Um, I know a lot of it is because, you know, they're trying not to be like the imperialist America, and that's been a lot of the, you know, the perspective. But what is there? Why do you think? What do you think has made Canadians so liberal? And is that more of like a modern phenomenon? Is that has that always been a thing? Because I think in the past, the Canadians usually had a really like conservative, hardy, almost like the sort of like the stiff upper lip, tough Englishman, but like a little bit more wild. Like I think the Canadians have the highest out of all the Anglo countries. I think it has the highest per capita rate of war crimes.
We'll take it.
But like Canadian
Uh,
snipers, for instance, Canadian snipers have like a notorious reputation as being like phenomenal marksmen. So
well, and generally being very aggressive in war until
yeah,
more recently, like that was the reputation of Canada. And like, Americans saying that Canada seems super liberal is based on the same thing where it's like you could think America is super liberal if you're far away and you're just watching liberal media. And it's the
mm,
same thing. Like we have in many ways more controlled media, and so it seems more liberal. But as you know, like I was brought up in Ontario, which is like a more liberal area. My family's conservative. And then my wife's family is from Alberta, the much more conservative area. And going out there, it's like even your most bleeding heart libtard is like, yeah, I vote conservative. Like that was the shocking one to me. And so I think it is just like what zeitgeist seems like is controlling the cultural consensus in the country versus when you go to different geographies, you notice like those are conservative values. Even if you have tricked yourself into voting liberal, like you care about this or you're tough on this, you think this is bullshit. And that's where I think like free speech starts to correct this and people start to swing back in a direction. What's been fascinating is 4 years ago, my brother-in-law versus my brother-in-law now, like the switch in him from being like, oh, like Trump's this, Trump's racist, to him being like, we got to remigrate all these people, like Canada's imported too many people. And I don't know. I just think that like people sort of start to adapt when they see things firsthand. And so anyone saying that's what Canada's like hasn't been there. And I find that there are very many conservatives. I think that it's more like a politeness and a failure to express yourself, which probably extends to dating in a way.
yeah, okay. So yeah, let's talk about that, because this is also one of the interesting things, and I really think that there is an Anglosphere dating culture that's different. Like, and we can
Yeah.
talk about like how there's differences in dating culture maybe within the United States, and how, and we will talk about this, how it's different maybe in some ways between US and Canada, and Canada maybe in the UK. But what's so interesting about this, and you know, I don't know if you can personally vouch for it, but is Quebec, right? Quebec is Canadian, but everybody, and I've had Canadians say this who are out in like you know, Ontario, or who are out in Alberta, that it's so much more pleasant dating in Quebec. Like you know, the girls are more feminine. The dating culture is just like it's there's more polarity going on. Things are just more natural going to Quebec than elsewhere in Canada. And you're thinking to yourself like, you know, because Quebec, it's French speaking, and it still carries over a lot of that French vibe. So, I mean, first off, is that something that you've also noticed yourself, and what do you think?
Yeah. So I went to school in Quebec and I agree with you. And I think it's partly a European values thing. And yeah, all of these are just guided by values. And I think that in Quebec, there's more of less of like a career focus. Like it was very common for me to meet people, much more common to meet people who were just sort of like enjoying their 20s and were able to live for a bit less, even in a relatively big city like Montreal. And then the way that guided dating was that you just saw a lot more people that were just like, oh yeah, like there's a lot more like open femininity. Like when you
Yeah.
go there during the summer, and I go there every summer, it's like that all the time. And I think it is just the European culture that they adopt, not even on purpose.
But see, this is the thing I don't like. We can talk about why it's there, but what is it about the Anglo culture that has produced, let's just say, less feminine women. Like I've, or is it just a different kind of, expression of it? And I don't want to be mean to all the Anglo girls out there, but there's an overlap in this kind of culture, right? Like, so for instance, in the UK, you have a real serious, drinking party hookup culture. And it seems like there's a, like you see women almost like behaving in, and obviously not every woman does this, right? But there's more of a normalization of women being like trashy, just like it's
Yeah.
like it's okay for them to get totally drunk and like stumble out onto the sidewalk and you know and just take some random guy home. And there's different like micro flavors of it across the Anglosphere, but it seems pretty consistent across the Anglosphere. Whereas in Europe, in like continental Europe, I'm not saying that no girl's ever done that, but it's like women, they dress differently and they carry themselves differently, and there's like a different set of way of interacting between the sexes that's a little less like vulgar and alcohol fueled. Um, and I don't know like why that is or when that happened, because it's like it seems like it was always like a lower class thing in Anglosphere countries, right? But like but it wasn't a thing that people did in the upper class. In the upper class, everything was really refined, and there was like very proper courtship rituals. And I don't know if that spread. I don't know what your impression of it from Canada is that created this, because it seems like, maybe it's because feminism really seems to have blossomed in Anglosphere countries. Like, I'll just make this little digression. A lot of feminist thinking came from, like, as a reaction to Victorian kind of modes of operating. So, like, a lot of even trad people today want to go back to like Victorian era gender norms, but that's not like trad. That was like that was like a fad that existed for 50 years maybe, and it was very, very sexually repressed, and it was very like, I guess you could call it to some extent, let's say, like demeaning to women, but it treated women like extremely fragilely. And it was like putting the bird in the cage in the ivory tower, that she had to be perfectly prim and proper. And so there was like almost like a hyper sort of reduced femininity that the woman had to have. And we had this situation later on where then there was a reaction to it. And you saw that reaction after World War One, when the whole Victorian England structure, I'm just kind of giving the history of how it fell apart. Then you had the Victorian England structure, like World War One, trashed that. You had 1920s, everything became libertine, and it just became much more and more this thing. Like from World War One onward, it was like the opposite. It was like, no, women aren't going to be controlled by men. They're going to do their, they can go and take, and they're capable themselves. And American middle class, as like after World War II, and all this wealth started to come, like America always like looked to British elites for a lot of like the aristocratic upper class norms, because the American elite mimicked them too. And so then you started to see the American middle class. Initially, they were trying to like have it so that their woman doesn't have to do anything, and she's perfectly under the guy's control. And then it was like, no, the woman now has to be really liberated. So I almost wonder, is the reason for this because it's a very just like, even feminism is an Anglosphere phenomenon, and it never really infected the other countries to the same extent. I mean, obviously women joined the workforce and stuff, but there was never, it's like, seems like they never adopted the norms of of like the courtship process of how men and women interact with each other in continental European countries. And I'm wondering if that's part of the reason for it. They just weren't, they maybe had the economic poisoning, but they didn't have the sexual polarity issues. What do you think?
Makes sense. Like, it's the best explanation I've heard for why you have such a separation. And it's also, I wonder if a language barrier actually helps. I wonder if it's like, oh, these ideas don't spread naturally across different languages. And so you have like an insulation away from that, from certain figures that will lead it. And even bringing it to today, though, like you were talking about, like more, we'll say, like, looking for polite words, say looser culture in the UK. And like you think of something like Love Island or any of those sort of like reality TV show soaps and stuff and what they glorify. And like Jersey Shore in America and in Canada was always like a novelty, whereas like it was nothing anyone, at least anyone I ever met, ever aspired to or was like, yeah. Whereas I think that there are more things in the UK where it's like the culture has become more corrupted by that like drinking culture. And I don't know, I'm still looking for a good explanation for that, because that doesn't seem to just be what you're saying with feminism. It's almost like a self-regard, self-esteem thing.
Yeah, it's almost as if like it became it in order to like embrace the ideology, at least in the Anglosphere, it required like a complete change in, like, I guess to reiterate it, the sort of feminist egalitarian stuff spread everywhere, but it just became a very economic thing. It never like, okay, women were gonna work, and because they had to work, and you saw this in a lot of communist countries, right? Actually, women in a lot of Eastern European countries, very very much used to working, very much used to getting education, even like very advanced education, and yet they are absolutely, in when it comes to gender interactions, not feminist. And it's very very peculiar. How do you have like this thing with Slavic women who like she can have like a PhD in like neuroscience, and she's still like making sure that she's like dressing like absolutely like like beautiful and classy, and very very much concerning herself with beauty, and there's like she didn't lose her femininity. I remember even with that famous ad where they were like in Russia, it was like a military ad. They were testing out this fireproof suit. Do you remember this? You know what I'm talking about?
You know what you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah. So they had this that it was supposed to be able to withstand like ridiculous like amounts of fire and like explosions and stuff. It was like, yeah, it wasn't just fire, it was explosions. So they had this like hot Russian girl who I guess she was a member of the military. They had her walk across basically like a fucking minefield, and in this suit, and everything's like blowing up and everything. She gets to the other side, and she takes off the hood, and she's got this long, beautiful flowing hair, and they give her a rose. I'm like, you would never fucking see this stuff in America. like they would never show anything like that. And it's like, it almost seems like Anglo women didn't want to be women, and like feminism had them reject some core aspect of femininity, whereas continental European women, or like Russian women, because it's not just, I mean, I think the Slavs are a really clear example of it, but you get it in the French, you get it in the Spanish, the Italians, the Germans. I think the most interesting crossover area is Scandinavia, because I think Scandinavia, maybe because there's such high English usage in Scandinavia, I think you've had more of a bleed over of the Anglo sort of drinking culture there. And also it's important to know that Scandinavia is probably like the original, like naturally disposed feminist area. It just seems to be very much part of the Northern European cultural dynamics. Even if you go back historically, they wouldn't have called it that. But even like the Vikings had much more prominent roles for women versus other
Viking
cultures.
was peak feminism.
Well, think about
Yeah.
it. I mean, yeah, you had shield maidens. They even allowed
Yeah.
women to some extent. You know, it's so I think it's always there's always been like the seed planted there, but they're like a crossover area because they're also still very much like caring about how they look, and it's not quite to the same extent. Anyway, I'm what I'm trying to just say here is that there is a very broad divide between the continent, and I do think the language barrier is part of it. Um, but it just seems like the women didn't take on that part of the program. They didn't. I don't know if they didn't want to take it on. Um, and it's not because like, and I think this is a big manosphere misconstruing. It's not because like continental European men are like super alpha. I mean, you can say that more of an extent to like like Russian guys maybe, but it's yeah, it's just they didn't take it on, and I guess we can continue to speculate on it, but it is what it is. And so I don't think if Canada, I guess is a way to say, I don't think if Canada joined the United States, it would really affect the dating culture too much, except Quebec, right? Quebec is going to get a lot more.
Well, like on the topic of like Anglo dating culture, say you have like a Canadian moving to the States, like would you advise them to do anything differently dating? Like to prioritize any sort of values? Would you advise them not to move if they were like so ingrained in Canadian culture that they might not adapt and find what they're looking for? How do you think about that?
No, I mean, I don't think, and I kind of said it earlier on the show more indirectly, but I just don't really see profound differences between the two countries. Um, I think, like I don't even know like what is like the different. It's like, oh well, we have free healthcare or whatever. That's usually what I hear. I hear something along those lines. Um, I don't think it's profoundly different. I don't think it's profoundly different. I do wonder if there is some like slight subtle differences, and I'm sure that there are some slight subtle differences. Maybe there's a little bit more, um, politeness in Canadian dating culture. Maybe there's a little bit more of a nice guy syndrome that goes on between the dynamics. It wouldn't surprise me if it was a little bit worse than it is in America, simply because of that, more like as you were saying earlier, people are a little bit more suppressed in how they express themselves. So it wouldn't surprise me if it was a little bit worse, but the differences I think are relatively slight. Um, and I've heard the same problems from guys in Canada that I've heard from guys in America. The only difference is maybe, and this is my own market, right? Is that if you have guys who are more like politically independent or politically conservative, let's just say not woke, because that's really like my market.
Yeah,
That those
I had no idea.
guys, yeah, you had no idea, right? That those guys have an issue, maybe a little bit more of an issue with with like having too many liberal options when it comes to women. To whereas in America you have more of the ability to get away from it. Whereas I've kind of heard that it's a problem in Canada. Like you go to Quebec and that's better because there's better polarity between the sexes. And it almost seems like to some extent, even though Quebec is very liberal, right? It's very liberal, but it almost seems like in some ways, and maybe this is just a weird outside observation, but it almost seems in some ways like removed from the sort of, they don't seem as involved with the Trump thing. It almost seems like this is like America versus like Ontario, much more so than it does. Like Quebec's almost like we are neutral, in this situation. Like
Exactly.
they're doing their thing, right? They're doing their thing. They're they're eating and they're doing their thing up there. But I or they're going to Alberta, but you might have more conservative girls in Alberta, but I've still heard guys struggling to meet them. So I guess, that may be another question is, and this is maybe more for the Canadian people about where to find people to date in Canada. But, Toronto is a big city. Like, you might have a lot of liberals there, but like, and actually, okay, this is the real question I want to ask you, Will, is how different is Toronto from New York City? Because like I said, I haven't really been to Toronto. I've only just had my shit taken from me at the airport in Toronto. I haven't left the airport. They took, no, seriously, this is a fucked up. Like, I remember I bought some wine at like duty free in Europe, and then they did the security check-in in Canada, so like they took all the shit. I couldn't, it was fucked up. I was pissed off about that. But how different is Toronto and Canada? Are you not there again? What the fuck? I'm gonna remove him and see if he comes back. But yeah, Toronto is such a big international city, and I know there's a lot of beautiful girls in Toronto. So I've just wondered. I was just saying, I like.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
With Toronto, I was asking about Toronto. Like, yeah. So.
Well, how different is it? I'd say culturally very similar. Like, Toronto wants to feel like New York, and I know tons of people that move to Toronto. Like, I'd say every year, like 5 people I know, move from Toronto to New York, and it's very similar energy. And that's why anyone talking about like big differences in the culture of dating, and if they're just talking about like London, New York, and Toronto, are effectively talking about the same sort of like urban, like hyper competitive, I don't really care about settling down until I'm mid-30s vibe. And yeah, the only thing I'd say is in Toronto, I've noticed a willingness to settle down earlier in comparable groups to the people I know in New York. I'd say people pair up probably 5 years earlier, and I don't know why that is. It may be that, honestly, that there is no real good reason, but it seems like Miami, everyone I know that's moved down there is like not even thinking about it yet, and I'm 32. New York, they're getting closer. And Toronto is, for some reason, a slightly better dating scene, and I don't know why that is, because it's gone.
Well, I was going to say, someone posted in the comments about how, like, wasn't Toronto ground zero for pickup, and he said Roosh wrote a lot about this, and he's right. I forgot about that. I mean, is Toronto like a fairly walkable city?
Actually, you know what? It's fairly walkable, and it's also, people are, I'd say, more open in Toronto than New York. Like, if you were pound for pound, like trying to meet people on the street, like you can sort of glitch your way into things on the street or out and doing stuff. And I think New York has closed off in a certain way. Like, people are more like cliqued out, or like, I'm a member of like this group or class or something like that. Like, we do this. There's just not the same established divisions in Toronto. I just think it's easier to like I've gone out alone and had crazy nights and just like bounced into people, and it's more doable that way than it would be in New York.
Okay. Because I'm
an openness.
Yeah. Because New York is really, really fast paced, and it's almost impossible to live in. Like long term. So like I'm just thinking about it. Like, it seems like there's a lot of people who settle down in the Toronto suburbs. You know what I mean? Like they might live in the city, but then they can go out to the suburbs kind of easily. I don't know. It's like New York has like a different relationship to the suburbs, I think, than Toronto. But this is just speculating, and I don't want to get too much into like the minutia of it.
But going back to what you said to my question about like a Canadian moving to the States or an American moving to Canada, is it seems like you would have to present your views different. Like, values are probably generally similar, but you're just like, you have to present views differently and maybe like turn up or turn down the amount that you're polarizing people, not sexually, but even just like how abrasive you're willing to be in those environments for whatever outcome.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you would say that an American Dane in Canada would need to be a little bit less vocal, you think? You think and not simply because they're like a little bit behind the zeitgeist, but because it just doesn't dovetail with the Canadian subculture of being like polite. Is that what because that's kind of what I'm getting
Yeah,
from
like
it.
I'd say Canada has like polite conservatives or conservatives, whatever you want to call it, but it's that sort of thing. And so you entering into that, like have your views, but it's not about being like I find like being very conservative that just people prefer to like in smaller groups talk about this stuff, not like they're leading with it or being super aggressive about it. And so I think it would just be like turning that down a bit. Whereas in the States, people value the honesty more, the openness more of, yeah,
Mm.
this is where I stand. What of it? And that's the big difference. And so someone might find that that is what the Canadians would say to like an American, like, oh, so American. It's like leading with their views without like being empathetic to everyone else's. And there's some truth in that, but there's also some repression in that.
Well, yeah, and I think someone put in the comments here that there's a lot of passive aggressiveness
Yeah.
behind that. Yeah, and there always is. There always is. But I think it's interesting when I think about like how this sort of Canadian subculture was created, because it seems like there's a lot, it is still like a crown under the crown, right? And there's maybe a little bit more British influence in it at this point in time than the Americans. Maybe that's also fading, but residual, at least in the culture and how people interact, because Britain also has this sort of veneer of politeness that you're supposed to have, at least and this is what the thing is interesting about Britain. That's the way it is for the upper class, but Britain is a hugely class stratified society,
Much
and
more so.
much, much more so than Canada. Um, and the sort of British working class, which especially you get when you go further like north in England, is I think in many ways like super fucking direct and aggressive. Certainly if you get some alcohol in them,
Yeah.
they'll like they're rowdy, man. I mean, there's arguments that this is why the British went all around the world, because they were like, we got to get these people off the fucking island. They throw them on the boats, like, and have them because I mean they're the British underclass is very raw. They're very raw. They're very violent. I think that we get abroad more of the picture of like London and sort of London sort of politeness, but it's gritty. When you go further up north, it gets real gritty. Um, so that's interesting, huh?
Well, and with that, what you're saying about the sort of more prevalent class system in the UK or at least in London, I think that plays into like it's a great place to do day game. Like you know who I'm talking about, like someone that you worked with had a great time doing day game there, but it was always not with necessarily Brits. It was with foreigners that were now living in London and who were then more approachable. But it's not like you were meeting someone like the sort of Chelsea, Fulham area who was born and raised in the UK and was very British and like was a member of that upper class. Like that, there's no openness to that. Like that would be
Well,
very looked down upon.
well, right, and so this is a good. So I think this is where you get to the intersection of what makes. You have London, you have New York, and you have Toronto as well. What these three cities have in common is they're big international cities, and so you're not actually just confined by the Anglo culture there. Like there's so many like New York City, for instance. I think it's like 20% or like of the white people in Manhattan are not American, like they're European mostly. So that's like a huge number of crossover exposure to different groups and to different Dane dynamics. So like, you're in a big city, you're in London, and you're not just meeting English girls, you're meeting like Romanian girls, and you're meeting Polish girls and Ukrainian girls. So there's a lot of, so you have that element of it where I think that there is a lot healthier polarity. It's not like healthy polarity, but it's healthier in comparison. You have at least more optionality. There's more dating subcultures, I guess you could say, that are happening in those cities because of all the different people who are there. So you can meet like a beautiful feminine girl who's not going to be like necessarily, and I don't want to like say that no Anglo girl is worth anything. You know what I mean? I don't want to get to that point because there are plenty of very feminine and wonderful Anglo girls out there, right? Um, we're talking in generalities here. We're talking about the general cultural apparatus. And you always want to be looking at girls as individuals in this process. You don't want to just exclude somebody on a superficiality. But I also think that those cities lend themselves to it because they have such a good walking. And I haven't been to Toronto, like I said, but like London, for instance, just phenomenal place to do day game because it's so easy to walk around. You have beautiful neighborhoods. You know, you're just out and like it makes sense for you to be out and about, and there's so many people there. And I think that that's just what makes it like a really great place to date. And I don't know how that is in the smaller cities in the UK, but the only thing I can say in favor is that smaller places tend to be friendlier. There tends to be much more of you have the issue with like the outsider, everybody knows each other, but that can work in your favor, or that can work against it. But I don't want to like go too far afield here. Do you have any last comments on the topic before we close this one out?
No, I think that some of the things we weeded out there, like the like slightly more classist in the UK and things are more separated, and then even like a difference in directness in Canada and the States, between Canada and the States, like that to me is interesting. Like, because I like to just think like if you had a client that was like, hey, I was brought up in Newcastle, I'm moving to somewhere like Nashville or Atlanta or something that's like not New York, Miami, or LA, but is a city, like how would you advise them on that? Because it's interesting, like how would you tell them to adapt? Because that's sort of like learning to read the room, I think, is something that some guys are missing. Like it's like not everyone can pick up on those things, and so it's like how would you advise them to figure out like what is the culture here, like what is the right way to like talk to people here when I don't know, like I wasn't brought up in this.
Yeah, because there's always those little subcultural differences. Even within a country, you know, the different cities.
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well,
and in a way, what I'm saying is like if you have guys that are more like logical or autistic, it's like how do you help them compensate for that and like adapt so that their patterns are the patterns that are accepted?
Yeah, it's all about, and this is one of the things that with game in general is so important, which is calibration. And you know, you have calibration to any given environment. You know, like how are you going to talk to a girl when you're in the gym? If you meet a girl in the gym versus how you talk to a girl when you meet her at a bar, or how do you talk to her versus if you meet her in the street? You know, I think that is something that a lot of, you know, autistic or like spectrum guys have a hard time with differentiating. But the context of these things matters. And it's not just the super micro context. It's also, you know, you can come in from a different location with a different way of operating. And some of it can be good because it can be a different flavor, right? Like I can say that the sort of more like American ballsiness, I think served me very well meeting women elsewhere because there's like a confidence to it, right? That I think you should always err on the side of that. But there is also proper calibration. You can overdo it if you come across as like too brash, too, you know, cocky or whatever.
Yeah.
In certain cultures, that is just not accepted. From what and we won't go off into it, but from what I understand, especially in like some Asian cultures, that's really not a correct way to go about doing it. If you come across like that, it's just, you know, you're violating too many cultural norms, and it's not attractive to the people.
It's like the guys that say, like, I don't like small talk. It's like, yeah, but people like small talk because it's how they figure out if you're a serial killer.
Right. Exactly. To some extent, you have to play the game. You know what I mean? You have to pace people. You have to ease your way into stuff. But well, anyway, soon maybe we'll see a much better looking map of North America. We'll see. Next show we're going to talk about what it's like dating women in Greenland. No, I don't know about that. Actually, I had a Canadian client actually, who worked up in the Arctic, and there's definitely, there's the Inuit dating culture, which I think is mostly just like very sad at this point. Just alcohol and domestic abuse up there. It's bad. But
Strong ending.
A strong ending, right?
Ending for everyone.
All right. Anyway, guys, thanks for jumping into the show. Yeah, day game in Greenland, right? We're going to Nuke next. NU UK. That's the next live from Nuke. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning on the show, and we'll see you next time on the Pat Stebbins podcast.